Ever wonder just how much power one company should have, in the fight game?
Yeah.
Well, we're about to find out.
Okay.
Today's deep dive throws a knockout punch at the legal battle rocking the world of MMA.
Oh, is that right?
It is. It is. It's the UFC, it's antitrust lawsuits, and believe me, it's going to be a wild ride.
You're not kidding. This lawsuit isn't just about a few jabs. We're talking a potential TKO for how this entire sport operates.
You've got that right. We've been digging into the consolidated amended antitrust class action complaint, basically the legal playbook from these fighters who claim the UFC is, well, playing dirty to maintain its grip on the sport.
Yeah, and they were not pulling any punches. This complaint alleges the UFC's dominance goes way beyond just being like a successful promoter. They're saying it's a full-blown monopoly.
Monopoly, huh? So it's like they're the only game in town if you're an up-and-coming fighter looking to make it big.
Exactly. See, in most pre-sports, you've got teams that are part of a league, right?
Right.
But in MMA, it's different. Fighters are more like independent contractors. They sign with a promoter. Think of them like the fight organizers.
Okay.
And the UFC, well, they're like the mega promoter that swallowed up almost all the competition.
Okay, so that makes sense. But how does the lawsuit actually claim the UFC, created this monopoly? What are they actually accused of doing?
Well, it boils down to this. It's controlling both who gets to fight at the elite level and who gets to put on those, those big time fights. The legal terms are relevant output market, that's the actual fights, and relevant input market, which is control over the fighters themselves.
So they're like the bakery that controls both the ovens and all the best bakers, making it basically impossible for anyone else to bake a decent cake, let alone compete.
That's a tasty analogy.
Thanks.
The complaint breaks down several ways the UFC allegedly built and maintained this control. First up, those ironclad contracts they're famous for.
Oh, yeah. I've heard about those. Like signing your life away kind of contracts.
You're not far off. We're talking exclusivity clauses, extensions for champions, matching rights, a whole buffet of legal constraints.
Wow.
The plaintiffs are saying these contracts are designed to lock fighters into the UFC and keep them from even considering other opportunities, even, get this, even after their contracts expire.
Wow, that's hardcore. But if a fighter's at the top of their game, wouldn't they want to be in the UFC anyway? Isn't that where the biggest paydays are?
You think so, right. But that brings us to a major point of contention: fighter pay.
Okay.
The lawsuit claims the UFC's alleged monopoly allows them to keep fighter pay artificially low compared to other sports.
Now that's something even casual fans like me have heard whispers about.
It's a big deal. We're talking a world of difference compared to boxing, for example. Top boxers routinely rake in, tens of millions per fight.
Yeah.
While many UFC fighters are, well, they're barely scraping by.
I guess even with the risk of those contracts, the UFC is still the biggest stage, so fighters feel like they have no choice.
Precisely, and the lawsuit argues that that's by design. The UFC's alleged control over the market allows them to dictate terms, and the fighters, especially those trying to break through, often feel like they have, well, zero leverage.
So it's like a catch-22. Fighters need the UFC to make a name for themselves, but the UFC knows they need the platform, so the power dynamic it's skewed.
You got it. And remember those acquisitions we talked about?
Yeah.
That's another way the lawsuit claims the UFC has, consolidated its power. They've systematically acquired potential competitors. WEC, Pride, Strikeforce, absorbing their fighters and, well, eliminating competition.
It's like they went on a shopping spree, but instead of clothes, they were buying out their rivals.
Exactly. And the lawsuit claims this strategy, combined with those restrictive contracts we talked about, it effectively created a bottleneck in the sport.
So less competition for the UFC meant less choice for fighters and potentially for fans too, right?
Potentially, yeah. The complaint also digs into how the UFC allegedly leverages its position to lock down venues and sponsorships. We're talking about those big-name arenas, the media deals, even the sponsorships that smaller promotions rely on to survive.
Right. It's not like you can just rent out Madison Square Garden and put on a fight card tomorrow, even if you've got some amazing fighters.
Exactly. The lawsuit argues the UFC uses its market dominance to strike these exclusive deals, making it extremely difficult, if not impossible, for competitors to secure those crucial resources.
Wow.
There's even mention of the UFC allegedly scheduling events to directly compete with smaller promotions, sometimes even at a financial loss, just to undermine their success.
Wow, that's playing hardball. So they're not just competing, they're trying to control the whole playing field.
That's the allegation, yeah. And then there's the issue of, well, alleged threats and retaliation.
Right.
The lawsuit paints a picture of the UFC being, well, let's just say very aggressive in protecting their turf.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Earlier you mentioned some big-name fighters who felt the squeeze.
Right.
What's the story there?
Well, the complaint cites specific examples like Randy Couture,
Okay.
a former two-division UFC champion.
Right.
He allegedly faced pushback when he tried to negotiate more control over his own name and image, after his UFC contract ended.
Okay.
The lawsuit suggests the UFC wasn't too keen on him exploring opportunities elsewhere.
I guess they wanted to keep that star power under their banner.
It appears so. There's also the case of BJ Penn,
Okay.
another UFC Hall of Famer. According to the lawsuit, he was allegedly warned about the potential consequences of working with competing promotions.
So it wasn't just about keeping fighters under contract, but also about discouraging them from even thinking about going elsewhere.
That's the implication. And these are just a few examples highlighted in the lawsuit. The plaintiffs argue that these cases demonstrate a pattern of behavior, designed to stifle competition and keep the UFC's grip on the sport, firmly in place.
Wow, it sounds like something out of a movie. But but before things get too, Goodfellas, we have to remember that these are just allegations at this point, right? The UFC will have their chance to respond to these claims in court.
Absolutely. It's crucial to remember that this is just one side of a complex legal battle. The UFC has consistently maintained that they've played by the rules and that their success is a direct result of, their business acumen and the quality of their product.
Right. Building a strong brand, putting on exciting fights, all that.
Exactly. It'll be fascinating to see how the legal process unfolds and what evidence is presented by both sides.
Speaking of unfolding, what are the potential ramifications if the court sides with the fighters? What happens if they land a decisive blow against the UFC?
Well, the stakes are high. We could be talking about a major shakeup of the sport as we know it.
Wow.
First and foremost, the plaintiffs are seeking treble damages.
Treble damages. That sounds intense.
It is. If awarded, that means triple the amount of actual damages they can prove. And
Right,
considering the UFC's massive revenue streams, that could translate into a significant financial hit.
Ouch. Talk about a painful pay-per-view, but it sounds like this goes way beyond just money, right? What kind of lasting impact could this have on the UFC and the sport itself?
You're right. The potential ripple effects are huge. If the court sides with the plaintiffs, it could force the UFC to make some major changes to how they operate. We're talking potential impacts on fighter pay, contract negotiations, and even the emergence of rival promotions. It's a lot to unpack.
Okay, so let's unpack those potential impacts. First up, the big one, fighter pay. If the UFC is found to be, stifling competition, could that finally force them to give fighters a bigger piece of the pie?
It's certainly possible. One of the key arguments in the lawsuit is that the UFC's alleged monopoly has allowed them to suppress fighter earnings. If the court agrees and, mandates changes, well, we could see a significant shift in how fighters are compensated.
So instead of those stories we hear about, fighters struggling to make ends meet, they could actually start earning, salaries comparable to athletes in other major sports.
That's the hope of many involved in the lawsuit. They argue that increased competition or even just the threat of it could empower fighters to negotiate, fairer contracts and secure a larger share of the revenue generated by their fights.
That would be huge. But what about those restrictive contracts we talked about? Could a legal win for the fighters actually change the rules of the game when it comes to things like exclusivity and long-term commitments?
Absolutely. The lawsuit directly challenges the legality of many clauses in standard UFC contracts.
Okay.
If the court sides with the plaintiffs, it could force the UFC to revise its contracts, potentially giving fighters more freedom to explore, opportunities with other promotions or even pursue ventures outside of fighting without being hampered by restrictive clauses.
So more freedom for fighters, potentially better pay. It sounds like a win-win. But what about the fans? How would all of this impact the sport from a viewer's perspective?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Some argue that increased competition could lead to a more fragmented MMA landscape,
Okay.
making it harder to follow the sport and potentially diluting the talent pool at the top. Imagine trying to keep track of multiple champions in the same weight class, but across, different promotions.
Yeah, it could be like trying to figure out which boxing belt actually means something.
Exactly. But on the flip side, more competition could also breed, innovation and excitement. We might see new promotions emerge with fresh approaches to matchmaking, different rule sets, even innovative ways of engaging fans.
Like instead of one big fish in a pond, you'd have like, a whole ecosystem of different players, each trying to outdo the other.
Precisely, and that could ultimately lead to a more vibrant and dynamic sport overall.
Right.
More choices for fighters, more diversity in fighting styles, and potentially even more exciting fights for the fans.
So it's a gamble, but one with, potentially huge payoffs for everyone involved. This whole deep dive has been eye-opening. We've gone from the bright lights of the octagon to the complex legal arguments that could reshape the future of MMA.
And it highlights something bigger than just one sport. This case raises important questions about power dynamics in individual sports, about athlete rights, and about that delicate balance between promoting competition and ensuring a level playing field.
It really makes you think. So as a fan, the next time I'm watching a UFC fight or any individual sport for that matter, I'll be looking at it a bit differently.
As you should, because understanding the forces at play behind the scenes, the contracts, the business deals, the legal battles, it all adds another layer of intrigue to the action unfolding in the ring or the octagon.
It's like that saying, knowledge is power, and in this case, that knowledge can make us more informed fans, more engaged viewers, and maybe even spark some interesting conversations about the future of sports as a whole.
Now you're thinking like a true deep diver.
Well, that's what we're going for. A big thanks to our expert for breaking down this complex issue with us, and to you, our listeners, for joining us on this deep dive. Be sure to check out our show notes for links to all the sources we discussed, and until next time, keep exploring those fascinating corners of the world around us.